Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law on Film, a podcast that looks at law through film and film through law. This episode looks at The Killing Fields, the 1984 drama directed by Roland Joffe, which depicts the Khmer Rouge takeover of Cambodia and the genocide that followed, which resulted in the death of approximately 2 to 3 million people. The film is based on the experiences of New York Times journalist Sydney Schanberg, played by Sam Waterson, and Cambodian journalist Dith Pran, played by Haing S. Ngor. It provides a haunting depiction of mass violence, as well as a moving story about these two colleagues and friends. We revisit a film that's as powerful and relevant today as it was when it was released. Joining me to talk about The Killing Fields is Alexandra Meise. Alexandra Meise joined the Northeastern University Law faculty in 2001. Professor Meise's research on sovereignty, statecraft, national security, and human rights stands at the intersection of policy and public and private international law. Previously, Professor Meise spent over a decade in practice preventing and resolving international disputes, including in human rights litigation, in treaty-based international arbitrations and public international law forums, and in designing and implementing legal reforms and human rights best practices. Her professional experience has spanned 5 continents, including work for the pretrial chamber of the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, through the UN assistance to Khmer Rouge trials, for the U.S. Department of State at posts in Europe, and in international development in countries such as Yemen and Bosnia. Since the fall of 2023, Professor Meise has been serving as a visiting professor at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where she's also the chair of the Women, Peace and Security Studies program. Professor Meise, Xander, it's great to have you on Law and Film.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about being here.
So the movie centers around the takeover of Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge and its aftermath. What happened during this time period in Cambodia?
Nothing short of a remaking and first undoing of Cambodian society. So during this time, we have an area that is coming out of the Vietnam War, at least the U.S. participation in it. But as the U.S. involvement in Vietnam is ongoing, a civil war has developed in Cambodia. And ultimately, in 1975, the Khmer Rouge regime takes over in Cambodia, and its leader, Pol Pot, resets Cambodian society in what he calls year zero. And he wants to return Cambodia to, as he describes it, as golden age of its agrarian roots, and wants the people of Cambodia to return to farming, agricultural work, move out of the cities, and then remake their communities in this way where it's the state as your family, as opposed to your family ties or other kinds of ties. And part of this involved severe shifts in the population out of urban areas. We see that in the movie. That's depicted the beginning of this mass migration out of the city. We see it in the movie as well, where we see scenes of people in farming, small farming communities and things like this. But also part of what this regime did was have such an anti-education, anti-establishment, the existing government system approach that they targeted and persecuted anyone who was considered to be a professional or in a kind of profession that had training, because this could be a threat to the regime and to the ideology they're promoting. So teachers, doctors, lawyers, journalists, government officials, you name it, they were targeted for persecution under this regime.
Yeah, we can see that in the movie in multiple respects, right? One, Dith Pran, the Pran character, who is the journalist, right, who's working with New York Times journalist Sydney Schanberg, after he's effectively trapped in Cambodia. In order to survive, he has to totally disavow and hide the fact that he was educated and working with a U.S. journalism outlet, but even a journalism itself. So he's pretending, or he's a taxi driver. And even Haing Ngor, who plays the actor, the first role that he was in before, he plays Dith Pran in the movie. He was a doctor, right? And so
Yep.
He has to hide that he's a doctor. I mean, in fact, there were some tragic consequences of his position.
Absolutely. Yes, this is just part of the heartbreaking story of his own personal life and what he had struggled through before he came to the United States. And yes, he was not only a doctor, he was an obstetrician. And he and his wife hid their education training and whatnot when they were moved to one of these agricultural camps, if we'll call it that. His wife falls pregnant. She goes into labor. She has difficulties with labor. He knows how to help her, but it was decided between the two of them that he would not do so, because to do so would reveal his skills and then threaten the entire family. And so what an unbelievable tragedy to have your partner in life's life in your hands, and you can do something about it. And yet for a greater utilitarian goal of surviving, you don't, right? And that's the personal tragedy of this individual. And then he also plays this character, plays this also real life human who has great personal tragedy. So there's lots of connections there.
The film talks a fair amount, and it's certainly suggested, about the U.S. role, which you touched on in what ultimately leads to the Cambodian genocide and the Khmer Rouge takeover, with the secret bombing of Cambodia under Nixon. So how did the U.S. kind of contribute to what was happening in Cambodia, or what happened in Cambodia?
Well, many a PhD dissertation has been written about this. There is, the varying levels and debates as to how direct it was. But there's lots of agreement that, look, the U.S. is engaged in a conflict in Vietnam. Vietnam is Cambodia's neighbor, so that's already creating tensions between those two countries. The Khmer Rouge is aligning with one side of the fight in Vietnam. The U.S. has its alliances in Vietnam. You have the secret bombing campaign. So before Nixon publicly announces that we're going to take action in Cambodia, he's already bombing Cambodia. And estimates vary widely, but at a minimum, tens of thousands of casualties occur in Cambodia. And if you look at timing, right, but correlation may not be causation, but at least we'll look at timing as to the beginning of the Khmer Rouge starting to be active in political life and then where it ends up, and overlap that with U.S. involvement, bombing and whatnot, you can see that as the U.S. bombs more, as there are more casualties, this does play into the narrative that Khmer Rouge is promoting, and Khmer Rouge does gain supporters. So that, by the time 1975 rolls around, which is as depicted in the movie when Khmer Rouge takes over Phnom Penh, and the U.S., of course, is out of Vietnam by that point. But, at a minimum, right, the chaos and the secondary effects of some of our activities, you can sort of draw this line as to how the Khmer Rouge had a smoother path to power, or at least could remark on what was going on next door and in their own territory.
It's very important in the movie, I think, for the way the movie depicted, Sydney Schanberg, Dith Pran, to let America know what's happening, right? And that's really that's sort of like, their mission, right? You have Schanberg, you have Dith Pran, and then you have the photographer, Al Rockoff, that's the John Malkovich character. And so not only are they depicting what's going on before the Khmer Rouge takes over Phnom Penh, but they are also among the handful of journalists who remain in Phnom Penh after it falls to the Khmer Rouge at great personal risk. There's one scene from the movie shows that they were arrested when visiting a hospital by an angry company of teenage Khmer Rouge soldiers and were almost killed, just saved only by Dith Pran's interventions. So what role did Schanberg and Dith Pran play in publicizing the atrocities?
There's a reason why Schanberg ends up winning the Pulitzer Prize, right, after he comes back to the United States. I believe that's in 1976. And it's for this reporting that he is engaged in as the country falls. And this is a very different time, right? And so without the magic of our internet and Twitter and cell phones and whatnot, right, you could only get information if someone was physically there to see it and to report it. And we see in the movie some of the struggles about, is the wire up? For the photographers, can I print a picture? How are we going to get this film out? All of these sort of complications. And so for both Pran and Schanberg to stay as long as they did, to record what was happening in photographs. But Pran's contribution is not just the photographs, right? And we see some of this in the movie. He helps Schanberg navigate Cambodian society, get inside information, get into places where he probably otherwise wouldn't, and also get out of situations that he certainly otherwise would not have gotten out of without Pran's help. I think of it as they should be seen as a partnership rather than as one person being sort of an auxiliary to the other. But getting this word out about what was happening in Cambodia, very important back in the United States. And the reporting about the bombing campaign, some of which Schanberg was the first to report on, as this information, comes out in the United States, you can see connections between increase in protests in the United States about U.S. involvement in Cambodia. Part of why we have a War Powers Resolution or War Powers Act, people kind of call it both names, which calls upon the president to notify Congress, when engaging in use of our armed forces, and, you can only do so for a limited period of time before actually needing congressional approval. That construct comes out of Nixon's actions in Cambodia and the fact that he hadn't reported the bombing, right? How that information then comes out. So I think it's really interesting in the US, and I can speak for myself as someone who then worked in Cambodia. I did not know much about this as far as what I learned in public school or what I, kind of knew growing up. And to find out about how many connections there are between things that happened in Cambodia around the time of this movie, right? Around this regime of the Khmer Rouge, and how this affected U.S. policy, particularly if you think of something like the War Powers Resolution, which is really important to the balance of powers here. I think a lot of Americans would be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, and another one, it's a little bit earlier, but where you're talking about generates increased activity in the anti-war movement. It's what I think was the precipitating cause of Kent State. I mean, a lot of it was the protests over the involvement in Cambodia, sort of a seminal moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There is that connection as well. So, when you think about many Americans don't know much about Cambodia, probably couldn't pick it out on a map, but there's just so many connections between significant points in our history and these seminal events that this movie is talking about. And that preceded this movie, right? Because as I said, there was a Cambodian civil war was ongoing before the fall of Phnom Penh.
And so in order to kind of bring the story home, publicize what goes on, there's questions around access to war zones that Schanberg and Dith Pran are trying to get. There's one scene where they're pressing a U.S. major played by Craig Nelson for information about access to a village in Cambodia that the U.S. had mistakenly bombed. They also seek access to information from the same U.S. official about the number of people killed. Schanberg's demanding this kind of information.
So how can I help you, Mr. Schanberg?
I was wondering if maybe you could give me some information on why my airplane was delayed this morning.
The plane was delayed?
That's right.
I don't know, maybe it's bad weather or something. But your flight and commercial flights are out of my...
So you don't know anything about it?
No, I don't.
All right. In that case, I would like you to listen to something I've just been listening to, and then I would like a comment. This morning, for reasons beyond anybody's control, I spent 2 hours in Bangkok staring at a seatbelt sign. Meanwhile, my sources tell me 2 Army helicopters are landing here, just across the airfield. Half the ambulances in Phnom Penh are waiting there to meet them. And now my sources tell me that there's a rumor that the United States Air Force dropped a bomb, or several bombs, on the city of Nyak Lung.
Come on, Schanberg, that's a rumor. Now, I'm not going to comment on a rumor.
I don't understand you. I just want to know if that's the reason why my airplane was delayed.
No comment.
How many killed? How many wounded? Thank you for your cooperation, Major Williams. When I scrape this story out, I will no doubt be quoting you in full.
How significant a role did these correspondents play? And has this role changed kind of over time? You kind of alluded to that.
The role of journalists in conflict have in some ways been very similar and consistent across, frankly, hundreds of years. And in other ways, they're different in the sense of the formality of who is a journalist and who isn't, what kind of role they have. Are they even wearing a uniform? So if we just look at a snapshot of, think about World War II, think about movies, probably some of which you've discussed on this podcast, right? There were lots of journalists that were embedded with military units, but their role was to be in the military unit, right? They're wearing a military uniform. They are there to record events, but also to not just distribute them publicly, but they are gathering information that then is used for military purposes as well, right? So it's almost like you can't separate journalists, at least some of the journalists in World War II, from military. There were certainly independent journalists as well in World War II. I mean, look at any major newspaper and whatnot. But my point is, you had sort of lots of this embedding and kind of restrictions, at least as to what some journalists were reporting. Fast forward to the time frame, the era around this movie, and there has been a big shift. By the time we get to the Vietnam era, right, there are journalists who may accompany forces on operations, but they're not going to be wearing uniforms, right? They state themselves as, my paycheck doesn't come from the government, it's coming from some kind of news entity or whatnot. And is there still a balance there? I mean, journalists, you think, should not be reporting on military operations that then could hinder those operations in the sense of put lives in jeopardy, but they are also independent, right? And there's that shift. And then nowadays, you look at some of the current conflicts, and journalists aren't necessarily formalized journalists anymore. In some ways, lots of regular people become journalists. If we look at the war in Russia, Ukraine, right, where almost everyone's got a cell phone. Well, in instance, they can take pictures, they can take videos, they can upload them, via some kind of social media platform. They may be providing information in real time. And yet, are they journalists or not? And these are some of the really interesting questions that arise, right? Different media outlets may have their own ethics rules and their rules as to how their formalized journalists should operate. When you have people who aren't working for some of these formal media outlets, things may change. So if we just look at the snapshot of 75 years of World War II through now, there has been a lot of change in what journalists do, what kind of roles that they have, and what kind of relationships they have with those who are actively engaged in combat.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, you feel like with the way Sydney Schanberg and the others, Rockoff, the photographer, Dith Pran, that if they don't, if they don't get the story out of what's happening, no one will know, right? And they believe they'll change events by doing that. But if you fast forward, right, to, I think really especially starting with the conflict in Syria, right, and then certainly now in Gaza and Ukraine, you have with, sort of the big data and cell phones and citizen journalists, right, reporting from conflict zones has become, well, what it means to be a reporter and the reporting and the information's, very different. But in that sense, it seems, like from a different era.
It does. And yet, in some ways, again, things are very similar. In anticipation of talking to you about this, I was reading up on my international humanitarian law, right? We look at Geneva Conventions, right? Media is not a protected class like, let's say, a medical professional is. They're supposed to be treated like civilians, and they're entitled to then certain kinds of protections that a civilian would have. But then we look at situations that journalists find themselves in, and often it's not situations that your average civilian would fit in. And so there's really interesting questions that arise as to, should journalists be having security forces with them, especially if those are armed security forces? Does that change them into a combatant? Like, from the lawyer standpoint, lots of really interesting questions. From a practical standpoint, though, as a journalist, also very interesting questions. Because do you want to be able to move about freely? Do you want to be seen as someone who is independent? Or do you want to risk perhaps being interpreted to be a combatant or not, and all the different implications of that? And we've seen problems with this. CNN encountered some problems in Iraq about this, but there's many examples from different journalist outlets about it.
There's sort of a break in the movie, right, when, it's coming from the title, right, after the U.S., Schanberg is forced to leave, and the other remaining Western journalists and diplomats, the French embassy is, I think, the last sort of place that goes. Dith Pran, we talked about, is trapped. He has to stay because he's Cambodian, and their plan to get him a false passport to get him out fails. And then it sort of like goes dark, right? Then it cuts to the killing fields, which is the term that Dith Pran coined, I believe.
He's credited with coining the term, and as he escapes Cambodia for Thailand, he, foot and by crook, goes 40 miles to escape to Thailand. And he describes multiple instances where he comes across literal fields that have bodies or other evidence of mass casualties, mass destruction. And so he describes these as killing fields. And then that's a term that, yes, gets then picked up, not just in the title of this movie, but something that now is used regularly with regard to Cambodia, but people will often now use it when describing mass casualty events or other genocidal activities in other places as well. But yes, he's credited with the term.
And how much did he in his account, publicize what was happening? I mean, how much was really known? Because you have reporting about the war until, the journalists are kicked out, and then you have the sort of start of the Cambodian genocide, the implementation of Year Zero. And there's presumably not a lot of any, reporting coming out of Cambodia. So what role was there at that point in terms of publicizing what went on at the time?
I think the movie is absolutely essential and influential in getting international focus on what had happened in Cambodia. Absolutely. That cannot be understated, the power and influence that has. And if we look at the timing, right, this movie comes out in the mid-'80s. This is, frankly, right after the Khmer Rouge regime falls in 1979. This is very fresh. There are many people still in camps. When they were filming this movie, the scenes in the camps in Thailand, there were still refugee camps in Thailand, right? So this wasn't history. This was still very present. And yet the world did not know much about it. Why? So many reasons. Geographic proximity being one of them. Again, different time with technology. But also, I think it has to be noted that this is happening, right, as the Vietnam War is coming to a close. There has been so much press and coverage about that, its context within the Cold War, other tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and whatnot. And so Khmer Rouge takes over, but I think that for some, at least in the international community, there's a perspective of, oh, this is limited and it is somewhere over there. And I thought we were out of Vietnam. Like somehow this gets blended in people's minds. And then as far as the American public goes, there's a lot of tension, emotion, exhaustion, and whatnot surrounding discussions of Vietnam. And because, again, this is so dovetailed with that, given the secret bombings, given that history with President Nixon and whatnot, I think there wasn't necessarily great interest in continuing to talk about Cambodia. And so then when you get this a few years later, right, there's been at least enough of a break that people have had a time for a couple of breaths, right? They haven't heard about it all the time. So then it does seem fresh when the movie comes out, and the movie is so well done. And you have such a compelling human story of Pran, of the actor also Ngor, who plays Pran. Schanberg, of course, you can talk about his experience. He's won the Pulitzer, right? So there's new appetite in the public to hear about it. But this film was the opportunity for many people to learn about this conflict.
And I'm thinking, as you mentioned, right, it's the reporting. It's also films, right? There's this gap because out of Vietnam, you get in the late 70s, right? You get series of really, hard-hitting, very popularly seen, widely seen movies about the war, anti-war movies. You got Deer Hunter, 78, Coming Home around that time, Apocalypse Now, 79. But this is 84, right? So it's like you had that sort of filmic focus in the late 70s, and then you have this movie about Cambodia, which was, as you said, much less was known about.
And Apocalypse Now, right, and some of those other examples talk a lot about the combat and the uniform person's experience. This movie, there is absolutely brutal violence. There are some scenes of people in uniform and some of that kind of action, but it's much more about the impact on civilians and impact on non-combatants, in a way that there certainly are some movies about Vietnam that talk about that, but I think it's a fresh take on a conflict in that space.
We talked a little bit about journalistic ethics and journalists covering war zones. You can see some of these issues being teased out in the movie. There's also this sort of question, which may have an ethical dimension, between Schanberg and Dith Pran themselves, right? They're very close, as you said. You really have to view them as a team. And it's one of the really other powerful parts of the movie. It's a really kind of complex, rich relationship that it shows. And there's a question about whether Dith Pran stayed too long in Cambodia when it became too dangerous, when it was clear the Khmer Rouge were going to take over and it wasn't going to be safe, and whether Schanberg had some responsibility, at least by failing to encourage him to leave. And it's interesting because I think there's like a couple of layers here. One is Schanberg sort of needs Pran's help covering the war, right? But he also says there's a sense where when Schanberg is saying maybe you should go, Dith Pran is sort of saying, hey, I'm a journalist too, right? And there's this sort of like a little bit of a kind of, paternalism, I think, between Schanberg, the New York Times reporter, and Dith Pran.
I was over at the American Embassy yesterday. Good news? No, not good news. They say that when this place goes up, they think that a lot of people are going to get killed. A lot of people. All right, I've arranged for the evacuation of you and your family. So now it's up to you. What do you want to do? Do you want to stay or do you want to leave? And how about you? That's none of your business. Do you want to stay or do you want to leave?
I know. You love my family, Sydney. But me, I'm a reporter too, Sydney. You know what I mean?
All right, we don't have to decide this now. We don't have to decide it right now. Take it easy. But we're going to have to make up our minds pretty soon, right?
There's also this scene later, right, when it's clear that it was a bad idea in the sense, right? I mean, ultimately, Dith Pran lives after 4 years in a torture camp, but it looked like he was going to, he had died. He's taken by the Khmer Rouge, disappears. And the photographer, Al Rockoff, confronts Sydney Schanberg. It's after Schanberg was winning an award or gives a speech at a press event. And Rockoff, the John Malkovich character, really dresses him down and criticizes him for putting Pran's life in danger.
What are you doing?
You know what bothers me?
It bothers me that you let Pran stay in Cambodia because you wanted to win that fucking award and you knew that you needed him.
I didn't have any idea what was going to happen.
Fuck you didn't. The fuck you didn't.
I did everything I could, and I'm doing everything I can.
Well, anyway, it's nice to see you. I'm on my way to Florida.
I'm telling you, I'm doing everything I can.
Yeah, I'm sure you are. I didn't realize you'd been out there to see him.
Don't play games with me, Al. Don't play stupid games. Nobody gets to go in there. If I thought I could, I would. I've sent out hundreds of photographs. Every relief organization on the Thai-Cambodian border has got his picture. If I saw one glimmer of hope, I'd go. I'd go today.
Thank God
Like
you
this
didn't.
non-fucking 40s movie. You can't just get on a goddamn plane and make the whole world come out right. And I can't believe I'm hearing this from you.
Are there journalistic ethics that speak to this, or is this just sort of like a sort of a moral quandary?
Can I say yes and? Both. I mean, both can be true. So I want to say movies are movies, and so movies take some creative license. Certainly not everything in the movie is exact to the book. Movies also like to tend to have good guys and bad guys and whatnot. I think things are a lot more complex than they're necessarily shown. But I think to presume that Schanberg had the power to make him stay or go is paternalistic. Pran was an excellent photographer and reporter in his own right. He, in interviews many, many times after this movie came out, after the book, and then after the movie, emphasized that it was his choice. So I do stand in the position that to presume that he helped, that he encouraged him to stay or somehow made him stay is not fair to Pran. However, I think let's take a step back and look at bigger journalistic questions about the relationships between reporters and their fixers, international reporters and their domestic colleagues in a particular location. And situations like this movie, right? This movie got a lot of attention, caused a lot of conversations in journalism circles, but there are examples in every conflict that you can look at where you have this, where there's this push then to recognize the importance of your local colleagues, the importance of those fixers, and to recognize the special dangers that those individuals are taking on if they're helping international folks. And this happens for folks in development, right? This happens in lots of different situations that involve people in a community where something is going on pre, during, or post-conflict, and international folks who are coming in and engaging in some kind of activity. Depending on what ends up happening, your affiliation with those international folks can have really negative consequences for you. And so this is where we get into certain formal media outlets have rules about this. There's certainly a push by lots of international journalistic groups to emphasize that, these international entities should give health coverage and security, right, and support for their local colleagues, recognize them, give them credit when they're writing stories, things like this. But at the same time that there are so many of these discussions, we see certain mistakes or certain problems arising again and again. You can look at, any conflict, and at some point when certain people leave and those who live there have to stay, what does that mean for them? And, that happens again in current conflicts as well. So there's a huge moral component to this, but I think there's also a professional component of this, because you then get into the questions of, should a journalist intervene or not? Is the role of the journalist to just report? Should the journalist take action, even if they don't intend to go in saying, I'm going to fight on this side or the other? What happens if you see an individual shot, or I saw something happen to a child and I want to help this child, so should I drop my camera to then go help the child? These are the questions, right? And I think there's a really interesting anecdote that actually comes from the United States about this and Martin Luther King, because there was a freelance photographer who, during one of the more infamous civil rights protests and then associated violence in the United States, puts down his camera to rush to help a young demonstrator who's been injured, who had been beaten by police. And later, Dr. King says that he was much more valuable as a photographer than a participant. And so I think this is really important to keep in mind. And it's something that certainly journalists struggle with, because part of the power of journalism is the perceived independence, that you're getting a story that maybe isn't from either side, especially if we're talking about journalists who aren't embedded or who aren't employed by a government. And so once you switch, once you start to be an actor, does that affect your reporting? And lots of questions arise from that. But once I heard that story, it always stuck with me, that there's this power of the journalist that transcends what might happen on a particular day or that pull to intervene. But it is a really hard and morally taxing question that arises for many journalists who work in conflict.
And with respect to Schanberg and Dith Pran, the movie, I think, does, it's kind of in line with what you were saying. When they were finally reunited at the refugee camp, when Schanberg learns that Pran had escaped, there seemed to be the mutual understanding. There doesn't seem to be like animosity. I mean, and for what it's worth, I don't know if this is the reason, but as I understand, Al Rockoff, the photographer, who produced a number of very powerful images of Cambodia, the John Malkovich character, wasn't happy with the depiction of the movie. And I'm not sure if that's because he was the one who sort of criticizes Schanberg.
That last scene is actually the most criticized one in the movie. And it's not just those who are there who criticize it, because it seems to be, some would say it's kind of a sanitation at the end. Like, oh, look, this movie has had all of this, really difficult and trying storytelling, but we're going to have a happy ending in the sense of we're playing Imagine by John Lennon. So when you talk to people who have analyzed every aspect of this movie, experts on Cambodia, experts on many different aspects of the conflict, they'll talk about that, shall we say, the last scene is not their favorite.
The reunion scene.
Yeah, the reunion, that last scene where it's the reunion and, the sort of all is forgiven. It kind of ties it up in too neat of a bow. I think that when you listen to interviews with Schanberg, with Pran, they press tour for the movie, right? After it came out, they were talking about it. And you can see and you can hear in their voice that it's perhaps not that simple. They both have still a lot of feelings about, of course, what had happened, the trauma, different trauma, but that each experienced. And so it's not quite as simple as the last scene in the movie may wrap it up to be.
Yeah, it does wrap it up in a bow, and then you have the placard at the end, explaining, as which is accurate, that Schanberg continues on at the New York Times. Still, I think he has a falling out with the publisher, but Dith Pran importantly becomes a photographer for the Times. So it does sort of tie it together, but it's inevitably messy. I mean, especially in the 4 years that Dith Pran had to survive, and all the death that he saw, and everything else is, it's something you have to reckon with it.
Absolutely.
Since the film, there have been a number of developments in Cambodia, right? And since the fall of the Khmer Rouge. One of them was the creation of a tribunal, the Extraordinary Chamber in the Courts of Cambodia, referred to by many as the ECCC, which was established in 2001 by the UN at the request of the Cambodian government to try senior Khmer Rouge officials for genocide and other international crimes. So how was the ECCC formed and how did it work?
So the ECCC is formed through effort of a multinational effort of the United Nations. You mentioned in my bio that the ECCC, and then you said, United Nation Khmer Rouge Trial Assistance, right? So this is part of an international effort. There was recognition that there should be some kind of accountability for the most serious offenses that had happened during that time period of the prime Khmer Rouge regime, so 1975 to 1979. And this comes about in the aughts. So after we have an ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, after we get the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, there was talk of should there be another special tribunal like that for Cambodia? And what was decided here was rather than having a pure international tribunal, like those two examples were, to do a hybrid. So the ECCC part of this is really important. This court, this special tribunal that was designed to look at crimes against humanity, genocide, right, the most heinous of acts during this time, was an effort of the Cambodian government seated within Cambodian courts. And at each level of the court, you have Cambodian professionals and you have international professionals. So, for example, in the judicial chambers, right, there's the pretrial and trial level, and there's also the Supreme Court level. There was one more Cambodian judge than international judge at each of those levels. But decisions, right, and verdicts needed a supermajority. So the idea was that you would not end up with just a divided vote of all the international judges, vote this way and all of the Cambodian judges vote another way. And even in the staff of the court, people worked in parallel of Cambodian staff, international staff at each different stage, Cambodian prosecutor, international prosecutor, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really interesting approach if you compare it to ICTY, ICTR, of embedding this kind of justice, right, retroactive justice system within a country's own legal system.
The ECCC did achieve several convictions, but there have been some critiques, one of which, to your point, is that it's been critiqued for having too much local influence, Cambodian influence, which skewed the process, right? There was some effort to protect former Khmer Rouge. And another critique is its treatment in terms of the crimes of genocide and whether there were convictions for genocide.
So when it comes to what kinds of cases the court took and why it didn't take more cases, the idea behind this tribunal, and frankly, behind other international criminal tribunals, if you look at the ICC, right, and the Rome Statute, these things are designed to go after the most culpable, right? The ones with the most power over these situations. So this court was designed to do that as well. Most serious crimes, those most responsible. The first case was about the infamous prison to Slang, where thousands of individuals were tortured for being seen as opponents of the regime. And I mentioned earlier, right, it focused on professionals, focused on this. But to be clear, the Khmer Rouge also targeted those with religious affiliations, those who seemed to have family ties, anything that was not a tie to the state, right? And so opponents of the state, so many were tortured and killed in that prison. And the person who led that prison was famously the first defendant in the first case. And then the second case broke up into other cases. And yes, genocide was one of the components of that. And there were a lot of criticisms about when there was a genocide conviction, why was it so narrow? When you think about how many people died in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge regime, figures vary, but they're between 1.9 million, and sometimes the figure goes up to 3 million. But this is somewhere between 20 and 25% of the Cambodian population at the time. And so how could you not think of this as a genocide because there was this targeting? This is what most people sort of think and how they approach to it. But genocide is a very specific crime with a very specific definition. And when you look at that definition, it's looking at whether there's intent to destroy, whole or in part, people on account of national, ethnic, racial, or religious group affiliation. Political affiliation, not on the list. amount of education one has, not on the list, political opinion, this kind of thing. And so the court, in finding that there was genocide, that verdict focused on the killing of the Vietnamese minority and targeting of the Vietnamese minority by Khmer Rouge, and also the Cham, which is a Muslim minority group that's also present in Cambodia. And so it is quite limited, and people do get frustrated by that. But this comes up, again, not just in Cambodia, but in discussions of when and where to use the term genocide in other places as well. Under the law, massive killings, even if they are numerically hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, that isn't necessarily a genocide. It depends on intent. It depends on this group. And so I think the frustrations with the Cambodian court actually are just reflections of frustrations with any court about what is genocide, who can be charged with it, what does that mean, what are the implications of that, et cetera.
What role in the tribunal did field evidence gathering play, right? This was one of the featured photos, videos, contemporary reporting, and what role does it play in other legal proceedings to address mass atrocities?
Evidence gathering is really important in the Cambodian tribunal. And I would say in a unique way compared to many other international tribunals, because in this instance, part of what the Khmer Rouge had done was en masse destroy records, destroy books and things like this. They may have kept records of their crimes, but as far as the history of Cambodia and cultural traditions and things like that, especially anything affiliated with modern religion and social life, because they destroyed it, the court had to engage in what ended up being basically a worldwide effort to try and gather evidence. So things that people had kept when they fled, different historical documents or things that other governments had, right, became part of the evidence in this court. And those working with the court, I think, really understood the importance of this evidence, not just for the legal proceeding, but whatever the outcomes were of the legal proceeding, this evidence was going to be important for the people of Cambodia and the future of Cambodia. The Cambodian court had a division that was the victims unit. It also had a very robust public outreach division. And on a regular basis, school children from throughout Cambodia, because of course the court is going on decades after these tragedies took place. So a huge percentage of the Cambodian population at the time the tribunal is going on were not even alive when the atrocities happened. So school children regularly came to the court to learn about the history of this time period, to see different kinds of artifacts, if you will, that you would see in a museum, right? They're getting that information through the court. And as the court, especially as the court was closing down, there was this push to how many things can we declassify? How many things can we make public and put into a public record? Because whatever this is from a trial standpoint, this is also really important for the people of Cambodia and for history more generally. So yes, I think the evidence is very important here. Journalists, though, if we take a step back and think, okay, what is their role maybe in other conflicts? What is their role in these kinds of processes? They can be really important. But as to whether the journalist individually has that relationship with the proceedings or the evidence or not is an interesting question, right? Journalists may take pictures, journalists may write stories. This is relevant for contemporaneous accounting of what has occurred. They have photographs, right? That's all well and good. But context is needed, right? A photograph alone, you may think it tells 1,000 words, but what happened around it, right? When was it taken, right? There's all of these different pieces of information you need. So not just any piece of media reporting can be helpful on its own. Also, journalists have an obligation. One of the things most core, I think, to any journalist will be protecting their sources. And that's especially important of times of war and times of violent conflict, because people, just even for talking to a journalist, could be subject to targeting from a government or from a fighting force. So journalists are often ruthless in protecting those sources. Then you have a situation where journalists may be asked, can I have your notes, right? They may be even subpoenaed. Can I have your materials? Will you come in and testify in a court as to what you saw? Or, some other kind of participation in the proceedings. And you see the journalistic community divide on this. Some journalists will say yes. And for the crimes of this nature, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, I have an obligation as a person, right? Putting this other person above a journalist that I am going to testify. You see this in the ICTY, but you also see journalists with the ICTY who say, no, I am not going to give you my evidence and I am not going to testify because journalists are supposed to be independent. I will report what I saw. You can take what has already been written and do with it what you will, but I'm not going to come into your courtroom and I'm not going to, reveal that next layer down of my sources or other things like that because I made promises.
And so, here we both Schanberg and Dith Pran do testify before the ECCC. Yeah. So it's in some sense sort of unusual, but not necessarily something that always happens.
It doesn't always happen. Here, though, I think more so than in other conflicts, very important that they testified because, again, we have a situation where there are very, very few records from around this time. So many people who were there died in one way or another, often at the hands of the regime. So while them testifying before the ECCC was not unusual, I would say it doesn't always happen when it comes to journalists. And a lot of what they got into in their testimony was about context to the reporting that they had done, talking about the events that had taken place because they were firsthand witnesses and very few of the witnesses were still alive. Decades had passed. So many people who saw it, mostly international individuals, when you think about the French embassy or other things like that, the perspectives from those places just were not around to testify. The records from that time destroyed, a lot of them by the Khmer Rouge. Very few people had cameras or other kinds of equipment that could record what was happening and were then able to take that material out. So the fact that these two journalists could talk about, yes, this is my reporting, this is what I said at the time, these are the pictures I took, and then give context to them was particularly helpful in this case, in these cases.
And just to clarify, we were talking before about genocide. That was one of a number of charges as important as genocide, and what the label signifies is a lot of this evidence would go to the other crimes, which there was even less, or there wasn't any real legal debate about crimes against humanity and war crimes, which were the other crimes. So it wasn't only genocide that was charged at the tribunal.
Yes, absolutely right. Crimes against humanity, war crimes. And then, as I said, there is genocide as well, but there is a mix of charges. And you see this in many of these sorts of cases that emerge from heinous points of conflict. So when you look at case one, with regard to the prison I mentioned, S21, so crimes against humanity that involve, for example, charges related to the execution of approximately 15,000 prisoners. War crimes, we have grave breaches of the Geneva Convention. Torture, of course, torture took place in that prison, right? That's also prohibited under international standards. So people tend to use the term war crimes to describe all of those things. They actually have very particular definitions. I know you've gone over this in other episodes of your podcast, but while there can be some overlap in the sense of one set of incidents might come up under several of these buckets, they are different sets of charges.
So we mentioned before the actor who plays Dith Pran, Haing Ngor. It was the first movie that he was in. He went on to be in additional films, but he was a doctor and he, experienced something, roughly similar in general respects to what Dith Pran experienced. He was in a forced labor camp, as we mentioned, lost family, including his wife. He was tortured. He survived. He used his medical knowledge to survive, including by eating like scorpions, which is actually something that we see in the movie, we see Dith Pran doing, but I think it's actually something that's probably taken. Maybe Dith Pran did it, but certainly Haing Ngor did it. And he goes on and also becomes an advocate about what happened and for justice and for, publicizing what happened. His end is really, to touch on, his end is tragic. It postdates the movie, right? He wins an Oscar, supporting Oscar award. He goes on, he moves to Los Angeles, where he eventually lives in the U.S. And then he's killed in 1996 after having survived the Cambodian genocide by what was initially thought to be a bungled robbery. But there was evidence that it may have been a hit ordered by remaining members of the Khmer Rouge, including in retaliation for Haing Ngor's activism and exposure of Khmer Rouge atrocities. So I guess, I don't know whether you've looked into that. I've looked from my research, it was sort of inconclusive what happened. There was evidence, it was never proven, but there was evidence. But two, I guess, what does that say about, that was in 96, but about the kind of tensions that endure within Cambodia from the Khmer Rouge era?
So the tragedy of the end of Ngor's life, I think, as an example of life imitates art, art imitates life. And tragedy is not limited to fiction, and it is not limited to reality. I mean, he devoted his life to his community after he came to the US. I mean, he famously still volunteered as a counselor of sorts to other refugees. The day of the Oscars, asked his boss if he could have the day off to attend the Oscars. He was so devoted to that work with the community. As the story goes, he and his daughter got stuck in traffic. They made it into the ceremony very shortly before the Best Supporting Actor award came up. But he lived and breathed this till the date of his death, and that devotion to the community. When you look at where Cambodian refugees ended up, many, of course, went through Thailand. Many came to the US. They went to other countries as well. In the communities in the United States where Cambodians ended up, of course, there were also internal tensions. You have this when you look at refugee communities coming out of all different kinds of conflicts, right? Questions about who may have been aligned with somebody else. Did they stay too long? How did they get out first, right? These sorts of things. With Cambodia, you have the added complexity that the Khmer Rouge end up making a political comeback in Cambodia in a different form. Okay, Pol Pot is no longer their leader, but in the decades that follow, and before his death in 1996, members of that regime end up in other positions within the government, or people at least who had affiliated with the Khmer Rouge during, some of these tense times in the past end up in the government. And so there then are some tensions in the communities here. And I think this is part of what breeds this suspicion. And then, the conspiracy theories that sort of have promulgated because it was known, of course, he's bringing attention to what happened in Cambodia. And as we said earlier, this movie, The Killing Fields, brought an international spotlight on Cambodia that nothing else had to that point. No amount of, sorry, Schanberg, but your New York Times reporting brought the attention that this movie did. And there was at least one political leader in Cambodia with a Khmer Rouge affiliation who said about Ngor's death that this was because the Khmer Rouge wanted him gone because he was bringing too much attention. So this is a conspiracy theory that doesn't come out of nothing. But to your point, there have been a lot of investigations and all of them have come up inconclusive.
Yeah, I think there's some evidence about certain money or money or jewelry that wasn't taken. But
yes, he was robbed in his driveway. There was some cash in the car. His watch was taken, but not something else. Teenagers were accused of the crime. And so people tend to point out like, oh, if they wanted money, they just could have taken it. Also, teenagers, perhaps not so experienced, maybe something happened and they shot him and they freaked out and left without taking it. There are so many different ways we could spin this and have strings on a board as to the conspiracy. But what I would take away from all this is just the tragedy that continued, because the tragedy of the communities in the United States or elsewhere who are still dealing with the trauma of that conflict, the generational trauma that comes from it, the socioeconomic implications that relate to it, and all of that. And I think that you can see that in then Ngor's tragic death.
And as you said, it was 1996, so it was some years, but not so far away. Now it's 50 years since the takeover. How much have things changed? I mean, now there are fewer and fewer people who are alive, or there's still some, but fewer and fewer people, right, in Cambodia at the time. I mean, in terms of the larger transitional justice and reconciliation picture.
Well, the loss of the ECCC as the most formal mechanism, seen to be the most independent mechanism, is certainly a loss for processes. But that doesn't mean that there cannot be civil society endeavors that continue to promote peace building, promote truth and reconciliation. And I'm going to emphasize the truth on that. I think, as I mentioned before, this idea of bringing history to life, having these documented records and being able to share that with the Cambodian people is really important. As lawyers, we often think that justice has to come through a classroom and a bunch of people, a courtroom and a bunch of people in robes and a formal something at the end. But a lot of times justice comes through other ways, and there is justice in history telling. There is justice in having a narrative. There is justice in having a voice. And so just as when we look at the Holocaust and the importance of keeping those stories and memories alive and passing these on for generations, as the people who personally experienced that are leaving us, right? They are all at this point very, very old. We can see that in Cambodia as well, that some of this is being passed on. Cambodia, however, is experiencing internal and has been experiencing in recent years internal government tensions. There certainly are some difficulties happening there with that. Cambodia also has had some great economic successes in recent years and has been engaged in active international trade with U.S. and other companies, and even internally different kinds of economic markets. So the Cambodia of 2025, I think, is very different than the Cambodia of 2007 when the ECCC first started, and is certainly very different than 1984 when the Killing Fields came out.
The other thing that struck me about when thinking about it from 50 years and the parallels with Vietnam was the pullout, the hasty withdrawal of the U.S., the French, the chaotic withdrawal. These are powerful scenes in the movie about the departures. The Khmer Rouge comes in, there's a relatively recent sort of reminder about that with when the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan, problematic. Agree with the ultimate decision was problematic and had a lot of consequences. It was sort of striking to see that and to see the sort of parallels when you look at the way the U.S. left Cambodia and the way it left Saigon. They're different, but it really was kind of striking. I don't know if you had that sort of struck you, but just going back and watching, because that was one thing when I rewatched this movie that I really stuck with me. It was about the way, just that sort of hasty pullout, and I don't know whether the U.S. was prepared for it, but it was striking.
The first time I watched this movie, I anticipated seeing the helicopter on the roof of the French embassy. I know it was the French embassy, not a U.S. embassy. I know it's Cambodia, not Vietnam, but that's where my mind went, right? This similar sort of rushed pull out. One thing that the movie kind of takes some license with is the Cambodian population versus the international population at the time. My understanding is that at some point pretty early on in this time when the French embassy becomes sort of the last thing standing, that the French government asked the Cambodians to be outside the fence because there was anticipation that at some point the Khmer Rouge may want Cambodian citizens. So it's not quite clear in the movie, but that was my understanding is the effects on the ground in real life. But there is this idea, right, of the fences that keep coming up, right? That there are those of you who are from here and there are those of us who are not from here. What are the obligations of each to each other? Why didn't people prepare more? Why didn't they know, right? And this is very easy, perhaps from our Monday morning quarterback chairs to look at. But when we think of the U.S. pullout from Vietnam, we think about what happened in Cambodia. And information sharing was very different then. Again, people have examined these a lot as to, intelligence information, other information on the ground and whatnot. But I think a point you made earlier is relevant here in that there were not many people left in Cambodia. Not a lot of international personnel left in Cambodia at the time that the Khmer Rouge takes over Phnom Penh. And so that limited number of people, limited amount of information, a different information space than we have now. You do have these few international reporters, but it's very easy for us to say in our modern times, they should have known better, but it was a difficult and different time. And you can look at many different points in many different conflicts where things go bad very precipitously and much faster than people anticipated. And so often experts will point to that with Cambodia, is that as much as people thought it was going to be bad, they did not think it was going to be that bad that quickly. Easy to say and easy to analyze and criticize with the benefit of hindsight. But this will probably not be the last time that something happens somewhere in a conflict on this planet where people wonder, why didn't you know? And why wasn't there more preparation?
So any final thoughts or anything else you wanted to add about the movie and Cambodia?
So movies taking creative license, you mentioned that the attempt to hide Pran in the French embassy and be able to get him out under a different passport, that would be an example of one of the things that the movie doesn't get quite right. It's a very dramatic scene, of course. Can they develop the picture? Can they not develop the picture? How is this going to work? What is true is they absolutely did use a secondary passport of one of the other journalists and try and swap the picture. But the reality is, and I don't know if this is better or worse than what the fictional version was in the movie, is that very quickly after they handed over that passport, it was spotted to be a fake. And so it was not quite as drawn out as you see in the movie. But many historians do praise the movie overall, right? Despite the fact that we could nitpick this and nitpick that, for conveying many of the most important features of the fall of Phnom Penh and conveying some of, especially with emotion, frankly, the horrors of what then happens after the Khmer Rouge takeover and what happens to individuals. So in this movie, there is a happy ending, to the extent one could even call it that, in that our two main characters survive. If that's happy, that is the outcome here, that they survive. But today, internationally, journalists are at great risk. And if we look at some statistics, I mean, this is according to Reporters Without Borders, between 2014 and 2022, 335 journalists were killed in active conflict zones. The dangers that reporters face when trying to cover armed conflict, particularly armed civil conflict, are immense. And it is something that the international community continues to wrestle with. And there have been some points of light that I think may have been overlooked by many who don't follow this space. In 2006, for example, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution calling for an end to impunity on killing of journalists. And in 2012, the major UN agencies came up with a comprehensive action plan for the safety of journalists. And there are other examples that can be pointed to as well. But whatever the time frame, being a journalist in a conflict zone or being a journalist in a time of conflict, whether it's kinetic or not, it's a dangerous profession.
And the movie very powerfully conveys that. I mean, as a general matter, and especially in the context in which they operated, so staying behind after the Khmer Rouge had taken over, and there was just total uncertainty. But it, ultimately was important. And the movie, I think, as you mentioned, was really had a very important impact. I think very unusual for a film to have that kind of impact.
There is a very recent movie that when I watched it, I kept playing in my head The Killing Fields. And the movie was Civil War. And it came out in 2024. And it's a complete fiction about a hypothetical U.S. Civil War and things that ensue. But the story of that film follows a team of journalists as they are trying to go to Washington, D.C., where the center for one of the sides in the Civil War is. And there were a couple of scenes in that movie that, to me, brought me back to the movie The Killing Fields. And I think if you look at movies about not just genocide, but movies about war, conflict, movies that portray the human side, anything that's happened since 1984, I think owes something to The Killing Fields, because this was, as I said earlier, a movie that was unique in its approach to conflict and the story it told about it, or at least unusual, if not unique. And I think that many movies that have come after it owe The Killing Fields for what it started.
Alexandra, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been great to talk to you about The Killing Fields and Cambodia. So great to have you on.
Thank you so much.